So next up, Dr. Nicola Gaston. Now, when I asked her for something interesting, she gave me this, which I think is fascinating. When she was 11, was it? She did a school project on biodynamics. Does anybody know what biodynamics is? It's the farming by the moon and all this kind of nonsense. It's nonsense, basically. So that was already a bit like, okay, but it gets worse. She completely plagiarized the whole thing. It was actually her sister's project from the year before, and she just changed the name. If Nicola could be reincarnated, she'd come back as a tuatara, although she didn't tell me why. But she
I've
could
given you enough, Susie.
Dr. Nicola Gaston.
All right, hello everyone. Sounds okay? Can everyone hear me at the back? Good, excellent.
Excuse me, it needs to be a bit louder.
A bit louder?
I'll see if I can make it a bit louder. Just carry on talking.
Yeah, all right. So I'm here to talk today about an interesting topic, one that's dear to my heart, and it follows on actually really nicely from the talk that we just had. So I'm going to talk about why science is sexist. And I guess I'll just jump straight into it, for fear of Susie. So I just wanted a quick show of hands before I get stuck in. Does everybody in the audience know what this is about?
Is that appropriate?
Is it? It might be on. I'll just stand here and actually pick things up. So Shirtgate, can I just get a quick show of hands who knows what this is about? All right, cool. Quick show of hands, who's got some sympathy for the man in this picture, Matt Taylor? Yeah. I'll come back to that at the end, and I'll explain what I think. So I'll come back. I'll explain at the end. I'll give you a quick summary, which is this is the Rosetta mission, a scientist explaining the landing of Philae on the comet, happened very recently. This is the press conference, just a still from him talking to some reporters. All right, so science, women in science. My thesis in this talk is that science is sexist, and we see this in many ways, in that this gets discussed quite a lot in the scientific community. There aren't as many women in science as there should be. They're underrepresented broadly, but in particular at senior levels in science. In more serious publications in the Herald, Nature, you see articles like this. There's a gender divide in physics and it spans the globe. It's an international problem, and we need to go out there and chase up some women and convince them to become chemists because we don't have enough of them for some reason. And there are lots of hypotheses about why this is the case. There's lots of discussion about this, but it's reasonably rare that a full picture is pulled together. This is a whole issue of Nature which was devoted to the subject about a year ago, and their first line in this is that science remains institutionally sexist. And so if I need a citation to refer to support the title of this talk, this is what I use. Science is sexist. What we want to think about is why and what we can do about it. What we can do about it, there have been many attempts. So this concern results in various kinds of strategies to try and do something about the problem. And one of the strategies is to try to make science more attractive to young girls, to entice them into a scientific career. And so this was a video that was created by the European Commission, the better part of 10 years ago now, called Science, It's a Girl Thing, and it had these girls dancing around like in a music video, lab glasses, lab coats, lipstick, high heels. These things go together. And I'm not saying they don't, but it was a very strange video, and it got very quickly panned as saying, well, actually you can't assume that girls are all interested in lipstick either. You've got to be a bit more subtle about these things. But there's a reason that this is, there are good reasons for these kinds of strategies. So this is a look at some data which came out at dates to about the same time as the video. Science, it's a girl thing, not a woman thing yet. So the top line is GCSE, so this is data from the UK. So at school, in the red you've got the percent of females in science at that level, and then you go down, you get down to professors in universities, and it's below 10% women. Right? And the numbers vary a little bit depending on where you look in the world, but broadly it's very much the same pattern. And so this is what we want to think about. Why is this happening and what can we do about it? Another strategy, this comes under kind of the same category as the Science It's a Girl Thing video, except this is a bit more personal. This is an invitation I got when I was working at one of our Crown Research Institutes a few years ago to a Women in Leadership event. This came via our HR, and it was organised by all the Crown Research Institutes in New Zealand. It had the Royal Society of New Zealand's chief executive there to speak for an hour, but then it had a 2-hour workshop on how to dress to influence. Yeah. So it's very much the same thing, and I think what these things tell me is that we need to understand why science is sexist, why we have this problem in the first place, to try and cut off all these misguided attempts at fixing it in very strange ways. Most of the story I'm talking about is not about outrageous overt sexism, but there are, well, can I just get a show of hands again who knows what this picture refers to? So this was a couple of years ago as well, the head of the Employers and Manufacturers Association justifying the gender pay gap. And so whenever you talk about gender equity, there's always this issue around biological differences that comes up, as though this might explain everything. And the reality is that it's not, but it's used as a kind of proxy for sexism very often. So what I want to talk about is a bunch of things that don't come into this category, but that are quite closely related to it. There was this talk in 2005, so a while ago now, from the president of Harvard that sort of kicked off a lot of discussion in this space. So this is Lawrence Summers, and in the preface to this talk, the introduction, he says, well, I only agreed to come here and speak because I was told I could be provocative. So that kind of sets up everything he said after that. But then he makes this claim that on many, many different human attributes, height, weight, etc., there's not so much a difference in the means, but there is a difference in the variability of a male and female population, and that means you've got more men at the top end. And so this was his argument. I'm not going to talk about this in great detail. I think the key thing for me, if you want to be a bit sceptical about this, is to pull out what he's actually looking at here. He's got height and weight, and you can say, yep, those are nice, easy things to measure. Then he's got propensity for criminality. Well, how are you measuring that? Overall IQ, yes, but we know that there are issues with IQ measurements. Mathematical ability, scientific ability, how are you measuring those things? Is that just by success in that field? There are real issues with the way that you look at the difference between the different kinds of things that he's talking about here. But broadly speaking, this idea that gender differences are real and that there's sort of some scientific basis for it seems to be coming more and more to the fore in popular literature, if not in scientific literature. So you see these sorts of books coming out, and one of the things that again makes me a bit sceptical is when you see things about how, there are gender differences, there are sex differences, but it's okay because the girls are better. The girls are gifted, boys are troubled. Women have butterflies and rainbows in their brains. Women like to talk and men like to think deeply and quietly. But it's okay because we're mind readers, it turns out. So this sort of nonsense, and it's all presented in a quite pseudo-scientific way. I think you have to be quite critical about what some of the literature behind these things is. Now, one of the things that comes out really clearly in science is the stereotype that exists when you're talking to scientists. Just yesterday, I was at the pub, and a guy sat down next to me. He asked me what I did. I said, I'm a scientist. He said, you don't look like a scientist. It was just yesterday. Luckily, he turned to the guy I was sitting with and said, oh, you don't look like a scientist either. So I felt a bit better after that. But these are the images that I got when I first went and Googled scientist, Google image search, first 10 images I find. It's not flattering to men in science either, frankly. But these are the kinds of images you find. And at the time, this has improved since, but at the time, the first image of a woman I found was that. So we're clear what the stereotype is here, right? There's no particular doubt about that. So now what I'm going to get into is some of the literature about where this comes from and why that stereotype matters. And this brings us back to cognitive biases, luckily, funnily. Somebody organised the program well. So unconscious bias in science. What can we say about that? What do we know? Well, we know a bit. There's one particular study which I'm going to run you through here. And so this is about the biases that exist within people working in academia in chemistry, biology and physics in the United States a couple of years ago. And what happened was that they were sent the CVs of two candidates. It was the same CV, but the name at the top was different, John or Jennifer. And this was an applicant for a job as laboratory manager. And so the CVs were then rated on the basis of competence, hireability, the willingness of the faculty member to mentor that person, and a salary was given, a suggested starting salary. And so there's some statistics about what the results look like. I'll summarise with this figure from the paper. On all those measures, systematically, the CV with the male name at the top did better than the CV with the female name at the top. And this was represented quite closely in the salary difference. I know it's a bar graph that doesn't go to zero. I'm sorry about that. It's from the original paper. You're okay to be sceptical about that. The point remains, right? There's a gender difference, and it's based on nothing other than the gender of the name at the top of the CV. And this is in the scientific community. This is a study done on real scientists. Here's another one. This is the Matilda effect in science communication. The Matilda effect is a general term used for these kinds of studies where all that happens is that the gender of the name of the apparent person gets swapped around. And so I think the very first study of this sort that was done had a Matilda and a Matthew in it. So it's called the Matilda effect. And this one is looking at scientific publications, how well they're rated by people who read them. You know, is this a good paper? Is it not? And how likely is somebody to want to collaborate with you on the basis of your scientific work? Right, so this is a quick summary of the ratings of scientific quality. What this shows you is that for subjects that are gender neutral, and so gender neutral topics in this set of data were things like the media, or I can't think of another one off the top of my head. The media would be a gender neutral topic. Family, children would be a female typed topic, and a male type topic would be something like computer science, or none of these things surprise us because these judgments about typing are made by asking people what their perceptions are. So for the gender neutral typed topics, there's actually pretty much no difference in the way that the quality of a piece of work is assessed depending on the gender of the name at the top of the piece of work. For female typed topics, there is a small advantage in having a female name. That's the second data point across. So the difference between the two for the female typed, small, but it's there. On the other hand, for a male typed topic, there is a huge difference in the quality assessment based on whether you've got a male name or a female name at the top of the piece of work. And this is reflected in the interest in collaborating with a person. So that's not surprising. Quality must be a predictor of the interest that somebody would have in collaborating with you, but it does just give a direct indication of the way that these kinds of judgments will impact on women's careers in science. This was another kind of interesting thing that came out and it got a bit of attention. Computer model predicts academic success. You know, science these days, academia in general, is pretty competitive, and so there's been a lot of angst about this in scientific publications that talk about scientific careers and how to be successful in science. And so a computer model was put together which predicts the things that you need, say at the end of your PhD or 2 years after, what you need to have ticked off in order to have a decent chance of success. And so one of the things that they pulled out was that actually having an identical publication record but being a woman lowers the chance of success by 7%. So there's quite a lot of data that's sort of building up to put this picture together. Now, if I come back to this Matilda effect, the different evaluations that we make about women's and the work of women and men. this isn't actually all that surprising. There's a lot of literature on this sort of psychology. It happens if you're looking at people of the same height, and maybe you've got people of the same height, women and men, and they're next to a doorway or some object, so you can see over time what their relative heights are. You're still systematically going to overestimate the height of the men relative to the women, because your experience tells you that that's the way the data should work out to be. And so we are always biased to make these sorts of judgments. And you see similar things with race and athletic ability or other stereotypes that exist. So this is where I take a little digression. And actually I've already made, well, Susie's made one confession for me today, so I don't need to make another one perhaps. But the normal confession I make at this point is that I'm a coffee drinker and I live in Wellington. And the kind of coffee I prefer to drink is a long black. And Wellington's a good place to live if you like good, strong, long black coffee. Single origin beans from all sorts of lovely places of the world. Beautiful, beautiful coffee. Whenever I come to Auckland, however, I order a flat white. And I do this not because I prefer to drink a flat white when it's 5 degrees warmer, which it generally is up here, but because if I don't think the coffee is going to be particularly good, I'm less disappointed by a milky coffee than I am by a black coffee. And so this is something I realised, I don't know, a couple of years ago, that I was doing this quite systematically. I'd come up here and I'd sort of think, oh, should I get a coffee? No, I'll get a flat white, I'll get a flat white. And I wasn't quite sure why I was doing it, and after a while I thought this through and I thought, well, this is just a bias that I have. This is just a bias that I have that coffee in Auckland is not as good as coffee in Wellington. And that's why I'm doing this. It's not particularly unethical. It's my choice. I still do it. But it's good to be aware that I have this bias, because now if I walk into a cafe in Auckland and the coffee looks good, and I see someone with the long black and it looks good, and there's all that crema on the top, then I might actually order a coffee that I'd like to drink. And so being aware of your biases, that's taking this away from gender for a bit, being aware of your biases is really important, because it's the only way in which you can overcome them. Right, so this is a sentence from that paper which had the CVs that were tested on real academic scientists, from the introduction to that paper. It states, on the one hand, although considerable research demonstrates gender bias in a variety of other domains, long list of citations, science faculty members may not exhibit this bias because they have been rigorously trained to be objective. And what do we think about this hypothesis? That's good. You guys are good. So then I'm just going to jump onto this. I'm trying to make the connection to the kinds of places where objectivity is valued, maybe outside of academic science. And can I just get a show of hands who knows or has read any of these books? Yeah, I thought maybe in this audience that would be true. I've read one of them. It was all right. But the reason I wanted to talk about Sam Harris was this particular quote that he came up with about 6 months ago, probably. Can I just see who's seen this? Because there's a few hands. Okay, cool. So this just resonated with me as being exactly the same old Larry Summers argument, really, but wrapped up in slightly different clothing. And yeah, so I've highlighted the bits in red that I'm particularly sceptical about. There's something about that critical posture that is to some degree intrinsically male and more attractive to guys than to women. Being an atheist doesn't obviously have the nurturing, coherence-building, extra estrogen vibe that you would want if you wanted to attract as many women as men. And the link at the bottom there is his response to being criticised about that. And all I'd say about that is that it validates his point at the beginning that people don't like having their ideas criticised. Yeah. All right, so there's been a lot of criticism of this on the internet, and it's been deconstructed. There's this whole bell curve thing again, which gets misused in so many ways. It's awful. I'm just going to jump past that, but these ideas that sort of come from science, and this idea that you can try and prove gender bias by relying on science in these strange ways, it seems to be all over the internet. So, you know, there's Summer and his normal distribution, which was like this. There's Harris and his normal distributions, which are shifted a bit to another. The one that's popped up on the internet this week has been Watson, of Watson and Crick. Has anybody, a few people have seen that? And so this is a quote from him about African people. Yeah. I'm just going to jump past that because I think he's making a racial distinction. Yeah. The testing says not really. There's a real risk, I think, and we see it in science, and these great white men of science who get held up as heroes, that they start to believe in this myth of their own objectivity a little bit too much. So this is sort of a response to the well, I guess it's the bell curve argument, right? The fact that there's this distribution and it's gender related, and this explains stuff somehow. And the point of all the recent studies on gender and mathematical or scientific ability tends to be that there are so many other things that affect the way that you perform on mathematics tests or science tests. There are so many different factors. So this is a study of different cultural factors on the relationship between gender and mathematical ability. So the top plot shows you the gender differences in reading tests is the top half of the top plot, and the bottom half of the top plot is the gender difference in maths. Right, so in the reading tests, girls have an advantage, which is fairly systematic. In maths tests, it's the other way around, boys have an advantage. But then you see the extent to which this varies from left to right, and that's looking at different countries. All right, so there's a lot of variation in the way that these differences show up. Also over time, this has been measured. But what they did here was that they correlated this with the extent of gender equality, basically, on some index in these different countries. And so you see systematically, as you go from left to right, as the country becomes more gender equal, the mathematics gender gap disappears, more or less. The reading one increases. I don't read much into that. I wouldn't, this is two specific tests that are categorized as a math and a reading test. You could do other kinds of tests and you'd find slightly different gender gaps or otherwise. But the point is that these things are influenced by culture to a very significant degree. Why does this matter? Well, there's a fair amount of evidence now that shows that something called stereotype threat, so this is the existence of these stereotypes and our awareness of them, affects not only the way other people might judge our work, but also our own behaviour. So under a condition of stereotype threat, which is if a woman does a mathematics test and is reminded before she does the test that she's a woman, and that there's a stereotype that women are not as good at mathematics, she will do worse on the test. And this is quite robust. It's been shown to exist under many, many different circumstances. Same test, remove that condition, that reminder, that threat at the beginning, and it can be quite a simple thing, like just ticking a box which indicates your gender before you do the mathematics test. If that doesn't happen, the scores improve. So all these measurements are sensitive to so many factors that we have to be really careful about what we think they're saying. Of course, this effect is more amusingly represented by this suggestion that you could just wear a Superman t-shirt to an exam and that this will make you do better. Yeah, it's kind of a nice idea. As far as I know. If it makes you feel stronger and smarter. Okay, so then I want to come back a little bit to whether we can dig into the way this is working, to what sort of biases are there, and how this is all happening. And so I think this study is a really interesting one. It's nothing to do with science in particular. It's CVs being evaluated for the job of police chief, and you've got two different CVs in this case. One of them shows more experience, it's a more streetwise police officer, and the other person has more education. And so there are actually different criteria on the table. And then you've got a male applicant and a female applicant as well, and depending on whether your applicant is male or female, the balance of these skills that is preferred changes. But more than that, when you get people to come and make a decision, you can do this in two ways. One is you can just give them the CVs and say, okay, make a decision, who do you prefer? In that case, the male applicant is preferred by a significant margin. On the other hand, you can say, okay, now let's think about what we prefer before we make the decision. Do we prefer more experience or more education? And if you do the study that way, the gender difference in the decision making actually disappears. And so that's kind of an interesting example of how we can actually use our awareness of our biases to think through what actually matters to us before making decisions, which I think is a really, really helpful point. There's another piece of this puzzle which I think is quite cool. In this particular study, they also asked the participants to rate their own objectivity, so their self-perceived objectivity. And here we see a rather nice correlation that for the participants who evaluated themselves as being highly objective, there was a very large demonstrable gender bias. For participants who evaluated themselves as not highly objective, the gender bias is negligible. And I think that tells us something about the nature of objectivity and how we need to think about that in the scientific community. I've got a few extra bits and pieces about why this all matters, why and how it affects women's careers that we have these biases. Again, there's been so much written about it recently. People tell me that as a female scientist I need to stand up for myself if I want to succeed, lean in, close the confidence gap, fight for tenure, etc. And so there's a sense to which all this data and having this data and being able to be somewhat sceptical about these messages that you're being given by your colleagues is really empowering for women in science, but also outside of science as well, I think. All right. So this is looking at data on where, on the differences in publication rates between men and women. So men publish far more papers, especially in these kinds of areas, but also the position of authorship. So if you're first author or last author on a paper, that means different things. And here we can see clearly on the right-hand side that women are, let me just double check which way I say this. No, didn't get it wrong. Women are much more likely to be first author than last author, and that's a question of seniority in those fields. And so this kind of gives us an idea about this leaky pipeline that we often refer to. I don't think I've used it yet, but this is the fact that we have something close to gender equity at junior levels. Through university still we do pretty well in most fields, and then after that it's the seniority that women seem to be failing to achieve. There are studies about where women go, and I thought this quote was quite useful from a study of engineers. It's not about fixing the women, making them more confident or anything. It's really just about the climate in the workplace. And so stereotypes definitely matter. Here's one where it's looking at both racial and gender bias in the ways in which professors in academia would respond to students who would contact them about the possibility of some work or doing a project with them. Professors of all groups were much more likely to respond to white men than to women, black, Hispanic, Indian or Chinese students. We need to be a bit self-critical about these things in academia, I think, because it does matter. This is an example of how not everything that's written on the topic of gender bias is necessarily true. So this is actually the deconstruction of a story which was reported very widely not so long ago about how female hurricanes are more deadly, and the hypothesis was that because they've got female names, people aren't scared of them enough, and so they don't evacuate as quickly. And therefore, female hurricanes have killed more people than male ones. It turns out that when you looked into the data and you looked at the data before a certain year and the data after a certain year independently, the effect goes away. So it was a bit of a, there was some not very critical reporting going on. This one, I think, is a particular problem for people within science. So this is a story that was reported, sex differences in the structural connectome of the human brain, which is turned in the media into male and female brains wired differently, which is already a little bit tricky. What they published with these pictures, and these pictures are looking at connections made between parts of the brain, but they're not showing all the data here. What they're showing is the few sections of the data which have a slightly overrepresentation in either the male brains on average or the female brains on average. So if you looked at a map of all the data, you would not be able to see these sorts of patterns. So these are just the tip of the iceberg in some way. And so on the left you've got male brains, and on the right you've got female brains, and so there's some difference there. Now what that difference is due to, whether it's due to any sort of wiring or whether it's just due to differences in behaviour or training or socialisation, none of that gets discussed. The way that this gets reported in the media is women are better at intuitive thinking, women are better at remembering things. When you talk, women are more emotionally involved, they will listen more. And this is a big, big red flag for me, because as soon as somebody starts saying women are better, you know, could you say that if it were the other way around? You couldn't. There's a really interesting way in which the science of gender bias, or the searching for gender bias, is emphasised by people thinking it's okay so long as we're saying that it's good for women, why this matters. Teachers think boys are better at math than girls, and that's pretty scary if you think about it. Teachers have a bias against Māori pupils, and I'm not, you know, these headings refer to teachers because teachers matter and teachers are really important, not because teachers are different from the rest of us, right? These biases are everywhere in society, and it does matter that we have them, it does matter that we're aware of them, it does matter that we know how to counteract them. So how can we counteract them? Well, we'll see what we can do. One thing that's talked about in science, in terms of getting girls into science, is to highlight role models. So there's the idea that you need to have a female Brian Cox, a woman on television, who's going to be this wonderful role model for girls. But then there's a catch-22 in this. This is a report from The Guardian about this woman, Rachel Riley, who was a mathematician, and she went on television and started talking about maths. And she was congratulated for doing it, but then somebody said, oh, but no, you know, girls won't follow pretty role models. You can't, you know, it comes back to the science, it's a girl thing again, the association of girls with prettiness with science, and the fact that there are some conflicts there that we're not very good at thinking through why these things do or don't go together. So the fact that she was actually attacked for being pretty, I think, was quite concerning. She's a great STEM ambassador, but even someone like me, this isn't my quote, this is from the report, with a first degree and PhD in chemistry, feels like a failure in comparison to her because she is slim and pretty and I'm not. So there are some really, really awkward things that go on when you start thinking about the expectations that are placed on women who perform these roles, which are necessary, but it's tricky. This is from The Onion, and I have to say that when I first saw it, I thought they'd stop doing satire, because this is how I feel a lot of the time. New STEM education initiative inspires girls to earn less than men in scientific career. Yes, satire is sometimes a bit too true. What can we actually do? Within science, I think one of the things we need to do is be transparent about funding processes, hiring processes, collect data. I won't worry too much about these different things, but just, you know, making sure that we're talking, having conversations on Twitter about funding processes, results, looking at what the percentages are, asking why, asking what can be done. And educating and training people in how to deal with unconscious bias is really important. That's probably one of my number one things that I think we should do, because I think this is really empowering. And, you know, it's not about changing the way other people behave, it's about giving people the tools to make decisions for themselves. One of the things that's really awful, I think, in science is how often it's framed as a choice, that women are choosing to leave science. And of course, at an individual level, it's a choice. But more broadly, I think we have to acknowledge that it's not the same choice that men have. One of the things I think we need to think about is how to distinguish between role models who might bring women into science and how we can actually support women who are already in science. And so there are all these projects like Wikipedia pages for women scientists trying to rectify the fact that the historical record is really quite skewed. But then maybe we need to bring people in to do other things, to do television shows. But then you can also think, well, for women in a scientific career who need support in that career, is that anything other than what men get? Well, no. Mentoring is a thing that we talk about quite a lot in science, and it's not gender specific. Women don't need mentors because they need extra things. It's just that they don't have access to mentors in the same way that a lot of their male colleagues do. And so that's, thinking about getting girls into STEM, keeping women in STEM. Two different things. They probably need different mechanisms. Since I've got the Hunger Games picture, I thought I'd address this because these terms are used in the book and in the movie, mentors and sponsors. And so a mentor is somebody who supports you in the role that you're in. A sponsor is somebody who gives you opportunities that you haven't actually earned. And there's a really interesting discussion in the business community about how it's actually sponsorship that is needed in order to fight the gender balance or the gender equity issues in the business community, because sponsorship is seen as something that's very natural to do for a young man. Let's give him an opportunity. Let's let him prove himself. But doing that for a woman is somehow, it feels a bit more like special treatment, seems to be the concern, and I think that's something we've got to get past. So recruitment versus retention versus progression. What do we mean about equality? What do we mean about equity? We need to think through all of these things, and I think that knowing what the data says about unconscious bias gives us a lot of ways in which we can do this. There is worse. There's some data on sexual harassment in science. That's not so great either. Again, reflective of society in general, probably. But then there are specific issues in science which need to be dealt with, and studies like these are important because that means that we can go on and do things about it. And so this brings me to Shirtgate, which is what I'm going to wrap up with. So that's on the left here we have a zoomed in image of the fabric that the shirt was made of, that the scientist chose to wear when he was on television presenting, talking to the media about this lander philae landing on a comet, this really, really cool thing that they had done. And I think that the language there is really interesting because he was representing a big team of scientists, but that's something that we're not very good at distinguishing often in science. And so I was watching this commentary on Twitter when it happened, watching the tweets come in about, oh yes, the lander's going, oh yes, it's doing this, it's all very exciting. We're not quite sure if it's landed properly or something else is happening. And then I saw these tweets pop up and when this guy went on camera. And so you've got women on Twitter who are commenting on the science, who say, well, it's actually possible to be a cool and hip scientist without being sexist and gross. Thanks for ruining the cool comet landing for me, asshole. Grumpy woman on Twitter. Really just want to be excited about the comet without having to repeatedly see this arse in his god-awful shirt. Fair comments, I think, to be honest. But there was a big backlash about the fact that this guy was criticised at all. And this, I think, was quite awkward because he was part of an awesome team that did some really awesome science, but it wasn't his achievement, and the fact that he then cried and apologised because this whole fiasco happened is not an outrageous thing, not really. So there were two aspects to this. One was the initial criticism of him, those first few tweets, which stopped like 10 minutes later. I mean, they didn't go on forever. And then there's what happened afterwards. So responses to those women, if a guy's shirt discourages a woman from a career in science, her services are much more valuable in women's studies. And then you get the really nasty ones, which happened a little bit later. You're extremely unattractive, calm your tits, it's just a shirt. And there's a really interesting undercurrent here because the women commenting on the landing often many of them had real expertise in the science that was being discussed. they were commenting on it because they had been involved in reporting on the landing originally. And so they had the expertise, and there's a complete assumption in so much of the Twitter conversation about how dare you comment on this, you're not the scientist. You also see a bit, if you look for Gamergate and the association between Gamergate and Shirtgate, it just... It completely drove the badgering of these women. I mean, you can see that in the Twitter record, which is interesting. So I think what Shirtgate tells me is that actually it's for people like Matt Taylor and the other men in science that we need to talk about these things. We can't think about it as just a woman in science issue, something for us to figure out. It has to be a conversation that we have so that we're all aware that wearing a shirt like that might have consequences because we know what the situation is of women in science. And so this is a conversation which I'll just run through. What's up with chicks in science? It's an old white guy this is the Physical Society in the US talking about education initiatives, so nothing gender specific. So he gets up and asks this question of the panel, and you've got Neil deGrasse Tyson on the panel, and this was his rather nice response. I say nice, there's a woman sitting next to him, and she, when this question happened, she just shook her head and she didn't want to answer it, so he stepped in, and I think that was quite appropriate. And he tells this story about, when he was a kid and he said he wanted to be a scientist, and people kept telling him, oh, you could be an athlete, you could go to the Olympics. And so his summary was this: before we start talking about genetic differences or any biological differences, we've got to come up with a system where we have equal opportunity, and then we can have conversations about any of the rest of it. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Susie.
Thank you.